You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Stephan Siegal from the University of Washington Foster School of Business, which is in Seattle. Stephan looks at how our inherited genetic matrix is the single greatest determinant of an individual's propensity either to save or spend. Stephan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
So some people manage to save and other people have, a hard time living hand to mouth. What is it that causes people to have this kind of difference?
Yeah, so we have looked at basically differences across people with respect to the amount of money they save out of their income versus the amount of money they consume or spend. And we were able to basically distinguish genetic factors from environmental factors. And it turns out that in the cross-section of people, about 1/3 of the variation with respect to their savings behavior is due to genetic differences. And the remaining 2/3 are largely due to individual experiences. And very little seems to be due to sort of parental effects, other, of course, the genetic transmission that happens from parents to their children.
What do you mean by individual experiences?
By individual experiences in our setup, that's basically everything that is non-genetic and that is not caused by other parental influences. So this could be mainly life experiences, job choices, or, of course, winning the lottery and then making decisions based on that. Something that distinguishes one person from his or her family environment and other people in society.
So if someone, for example, doesn't have a good job, he's not well educated and he just never quite seems to earn enough money, that would be considered an individual circumstance that would perhaps make him someone who can't spend a lot because he doesn't have a lot?
To the extent that that is not also due to genetic factors, right? Many choices in life are also, again, expressions of the genetic makeup of a person. Things like income, for example, or even job choices have been shown to have a genetic foundation as well. But to the extent that there are aspects of it that are not reflections of this genetic makeup, this would be individual experiences. That is right.
And so if your parents, let's say, are good spenders or good savers, let's start with the good trait, I suppose, you feel that learning that at home, watching your parents squirrel away 10 or 15% of their income every month, doesn't train kids to become good savers as well?
That's what our results on average would suggest, that indeed, sort of once we account for the genetic transmission that happens naturally from parents to their children, then there is little else left that gets transmitted from parents to their children with respect to their savings choices. While this is true on average, it varies a little bit, for example, over the age of a person. So we do find that young adults, and in our sample those are between 20 and 25, do show influence of sort of parental environment, but that influence decays quite rapidly, and by the time that people reach the age of about 40, the parental influence has gone down to 0, while the genetic influence basically persists all the way until retirement. That's when our sample ends.
So how can you differentiate between the genetic influence and the parental influence?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we make use of a very traditional twin study design, where we basically have access to two types of twins, which are identical twins and fraternal twins. And it's that difference between sort of the genetic similarity in these two twin types that allow us to differentiate the genetic influence and the parental influence. Essentially, the identical twins are, as the word suggests, genetically identical, while the fraternal twins are just like any other siblings. They are on average genetically correlated by about 50%. And so if a given trait, in this case savings behavior, has a genetic basis, then we would expect that the two identical twins on average behave more similarly than the fraternal twins.
But I presume that's not what you found.
No, that is what we find, that the identical twins sort of in their savings decisions are more similar to one another than the fraternal twins. And it's sort of this degree of, if you want, excess similarity that we find in the identical twins relative to the fraternal twins that allows us to ultimately estimate the importance of genes. versus the importance of nurture, which is assumed to be the same for both types of twins, right? Parents treat their children, in our model at least, the same way no matter if the children are identical or fraternal twins.
Okay, so the model that you're using is you look at a pair of identical twins, and then you've discovered that they act similarly throughout their lives in terms of saving.
That's correct. And then we compare this to the fraternal twins,
who presumably do not necessarily act as similarly.
That's right. They still act similarly, so that's why on average we find that children are similar to their parents in many important financial decisions, but they are not as similar in their behavior as the identical twins, and that is what sort of allows us to find, if you want, the genetic component.
Okay. We're talking to Stephan Siegel, who's from the University of Washington. He studies the genetic relationship to a person's financial life. He's been explaining to us how they've identified that there is in fact a gene which seems to make people either more likely to be a saver or more likely to be a spender. So I've got to ask you now, from my perspective as a financial advisor, I'm only on the radio once a week, but I spend most of my time doing financial planning and investments for clients. And frequently I find people, either they overspend or they don't save enough. And I try to coach them and encourage them and cajole them to become more in tune with their budget. And it just doesn't always work. Would you say this is simply a genetic problem?
Well, I think a part of the differences that you observe in your clients is due to their genetic makeup. And indeed, we sort of have looked at other decisions that we can observe among our twins, and we do find that, for example, that those that save little are also more likely, for example, in our data set to smoke or to be obese. And so then sort of this would sort of suggest that there is sort of a common cause, if you want, that we can consider maybe lack of self-control to some extent. And we are further able to decompose this correlation between these different decisions, savings on the one side and smoking and obesity, if you want, on the other side. And we do find that sort of the reason that these things are correlated is entirely genetic. So it is true that sort of some of the variation is because of genetic factors, and that seems to sort of these genetic factors seem to affect many aspects of a person's life. But it's also, of course, true that people can counter these genetic predispositions by making choices in form of delegating some of their financial decisions to, for example, financial advisors, so that their financial decisions are not affected that much by their genetic predisposition to maybe save little.
Okay, so that's very nice in terms of the investing, but day to day, I have to let my clients out of the house with their wallet and their credit card. And if I tell the client, listen, you need to be saving an extra $1,000 a month, and he says to me, Doug, I read that study by Professor Siegel, and I just can't do it. You're asking me to put a square peg through a circle hole. It's simply impossible. Is that true, or should I really just say, okay, very nice, but now focus on your budget?
I don't know if I have a very good answer to this. It's thinking about the welfare implications of sort of these, if you want, behavioral biases or just predispositions that people have is quite difficult, right? Because your client might indeed be miserable if he is forced to not spend as much as he would like to, and therefore might not necessarily be better off by being forced to do something which goes against his underlying nature, if you want. At the same time, of course, to the extent that choices are time inconsistent, that people realize in the long run they would have been better off if they have saved more, but in the short run they just find it hard to do, then I think we could make an argument that constraining them or forcing them to save more today might actually be better for them in the long run. But that's a very difficult question which I think we don't our study does not provide an answer to that. We can just say that these underlying predispositions are very strong and powerful, but at the same time, of course, they don't make up the entire differences that we observe. There are elements of personal decisions that show up in the data that we observe. Otherwise, our identical twins would have to behave exactly identically, which they don't. They just behave more correlated than fraternal twins, but they don't behave the same way. So they make decisions that are different from one another.
So when you say you've identified a gene, Have you identified a specific gene, meaning can you give a blood test to someone and determine whether he's a saver or a spender?
So that's a good question. So our study basically just talks about the broad sources of variation. So we don't identify individual genes. We just identify the importance of genetic variation, and that's about a third in the cross section that we look at. The other people sort of have studied indeed sort of gene associations with certain behaviors, and there have been a few genes that have been associated with impulsivity, which is sort of one element that you can think about of underlying impatience and ultimately savings decisions. But I think the idea of having a very complete model that would allow us to tell someone based on their genome whether or not they are a saver and a spender is still a few years away. But it's completely possible, at least, that one day we can do something like that. You can see a genome scan of your clients and you could understand at least what their genetic predisposition are, and that might sort of tailor the solutions that you might offer in a certain way, right? You might impose less or fewer constraints giving their underlying predispositions.
I hear. Unfortunately, that might just end up in meaning a failure for the long-term financial plan. When you did your study, did you look around the world? Is there a difference in different cultures?
Yeah, our study is completely confined to the setting in Sweden. So our data comes from the Swedish twin study, and so all the subjects in our data set are Swedish citizens. And so we can only speak about sort of the relevance of genetic variation relative to the environmental variation in Sweden in the early 2000s. And therefore we cannot account for importances in sort of either government regulation or cultural elements that clearly matter across countries. Since we only have one country, we don't know how important those elements are on a global scale.
And do you think that the results of your study could be attributed to anything other than genetics?
So, well, I mean, the variation that we observe is not entirely genetic. So in that sense, yes, 70% or 65% of the decisions people make with respect to savings decisions do reflect other things. These are the individual experiences that we talked about earlier. But I think with respect to the genetics variation, we are pretty confident that that is a reasonable estimate. One concern that people often raise is that identical twins are sort of more similar not only genetically, but also in how they get treated by parents or other people in the environment. So we actually do a robustness test where we look at twins that were reared apart, so that were separated early on in their lives and grew up in different households. Mm-hmm. And we do find that generally the results are very similar. The point estimates are noisier because it's a very small set, but overall we do find that there is a significant genetic component of similar size that sort of explains the differences in savings decisions in this much smaller set.
Wow. It's a fascinating study, and I think it's very important, especially for people in my field as a financial advisor, just to be aware that this is out there. It's not exactly clear to me what I should do about it, nuts and bolts, but at least it's good to know that there is a tendency that people might have that we have to either work with or work against in order to save them from themselves. We've been speaking to Stephan Siegel, who is from the University of Washington in Seattle. He looks at how genetics and personal finance overlap. Stephan, in the last few seconds, could you just tell us how could people follow your work or learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, all of our papers are available on the Social Science Research Network, which is ssrn.com, or people can just Google my name, Stephan Siegel, and they will immediately find my website where all my papers are listed as well.
Okay, great. Stephan Siegel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.